Let me begin by, first of all, thanking the director of RCC, Prof, for your visionary leadership. Permit me to also extend my appreciation to the managing director, who is also the convener of this prestigious assembly. Finally, grant me the latitude to also thank the land house manager, Moremi, the RCC community, and friends of goodwill who have joined us this afternoon. It is indeed a great pleasure to be given the opportunity to share with you my thought on a topic that I think is relevant, not only for young people in a geographical enclave called South Africa, and by extension Africa, but for young people across different regions. Before I proceed, permit me to make two declarations. The first is that this afternoon's presentation is drawn from a chapter of a book I'm still working on. To that extent, I will not read from the chapter, but I will just speak to the chapter. The second is that the presentation will not follow the conventional scientific format. It will rather adopt a more reflective and analytic approach. And normally, when one is actually called up to address such a prestigious assembly, one is often tempted to consider or to, first of all, begin the presentation with definitions. I'm a bit hesitant to follow that path, simply because normally some concept or keywords, when one attempts to define them, they are more or less like the Hydra, a multi-headed monster. An attempt to define them only might create more confusion. Having said that, I will try and conceptualize the keywords within this discussion. The first is youth, and normally when we speak of youth, what does it imply? What does it connote? And youth itself is quite contentious concept. And normally its definition is often extracted from where one sits or where one finds him or herself. In the context of Africa, when we speak of youth, it actually applies to those between the ages of 15 and 35. And that is how the African Youth Charter defines this subpopulation. And when you climb up to the global north, the EU conceptualizes this camp as those between 15 and 29. And then when we go to the UN level, when you say you are youth, it's between those who are 15 and 24. And I presume since we are on a global platform, it might be safe to adopt the UN definition. I presume that excludes many of us in this room. And I think it's also quite sad to be told that you are 25 and then you are an elderly person. My apologies. And when we speak of climate change, normally climate change can simply be construed as a long-term change in the weather pattern. And as we speak, there are muted talks of drought hitting parts of Eastern and Southern Africa. And these were areas which previously used to have experienced considerable rainfall at this time of the year. And that is how we can simply define climate change. But having said that, you cannot speak about climate change and youth without considering a very important concept, which is intergenerational equity. There are various definitions, but simply, it actually implies the fairness or the fair use of resources between the elderly population and the young population. What does it mean? And this concept has actually been well articulated by a simple African proverb, and that is that the land in which we inhabit is not a gift granted to us by our ancestors, but rather it is a loan which has been given to us by our children. And I believe to that extent, this principle imposes a moral obligation, a responsibility on us to sustain the earth rather than deplete it. But can we say we have actually lived up to this moral obligation? I presume since the birth of the Industrial Revolution in the year 1760, man has actually explored and consumed large proportion of coal to power a considerable amount of energy. And that is despite considerable amount of literature which have documented the negative impact of coal on the planet. As we speak, there are more than 88 countries which depend on coal as a source of energy. And it is therefore not surprising to see that there are a number of young people who continuously take to the street to demonstrate their unhappiness, their discontent. If one look at the pattern of young people who are actually protesting, there is enormous amount of depletion which our leaders, on which, and as individuals, we are also causing to the environment. One is bound to see that there are three kind of players. Normally, we see only one phase of people who are demonstrating. In this picture, one can see some of the leading pioneers of the Friday for Future movement. And I believe most of you know the young Greta and, of course, Vanessa Takita as some of the leading pioneers of this movement. I'll come back to this picture. But besides these young people who are actually demonstrating, there are others who have actually joined this movement. The second camp which have joined this movement are young mothers. And they are actually taking to the streets, not for themselves, but for their children who are not able to express their disappointment. Besides this, there is a third camp, which is mothers who are actually feeling the pain of their children. As you can see, it states that it is hot in here. The babies or the unborn children are also crying of the global warming that they're experiencing. This begs the question, has the rising movement, has the mobilization of the youth themselves, of young mothers and of expectant mothers, have this mobilization actually led to a shift in phasing out one of the deadliest gases known to mankind? In other words, what is the connection between all these three group of people who are actually taken to the street? And one can see that there is a golden thread running through this movement. And what is this? That is an end to coal. That is the symbol of their discontent, of their mobilization. And the question that we ought to ask ourselves is, has this movement actually led to a shift in energy consumption? Has this movement actually led to phasing out coal? It is very difficult to respond to, but as I speak, I am aware that Belgium has actually completely phased out coal, which is a good thing, but the remaining 88 countries are still bent on consuming coal. As we speak, South Africa depends on 15 powered coal plants, and that is what it depends on to feed, to generate about 80% of its energy capacity throughout the country. The country is currently experiencing load shedding. In other words, that the amount of energy being supplied to the population is not enough. And following the recent COP26, the country was actually granted $8.5 billion to actually shift from coal. But what has the country done? The Minister for Energy actually announced in October last year, in 2021, that the money is actually going to be used to expand or to erect 3 more coal-powered plants. It is therefore not surprising that a month later, after making this announcement, a group of young people took to the courtroom to actually register their discontent. In other words, they went to file a lawsuit against the government. The lawsuit contains 2 key provisions. The first one is that the court ought to order the government to stop erecting more coal plants. The second is that they want the government to stop using coal now. Well, to activists, this seems to be the way to be a victory in the first instance. But to someone who is very skeptical or a realist like myself, I pondered, can this suit actually lead to victory? Is it possible to actually transform or actually move the country away from coal? And this skepticism is actually drawn from a recent case known as Juliana versus US. The case was actually filed in 2015 against the Obama administration by 21 young people. And the content of the case basically was that the young people wanted the American government to actually shift from using coal in producing energy to other renewables. Ultimately, the case took 5 years, until almost 6 years, until last year, October. And I can say the year of October was a year of climate litigation, back and forth. Eventually, after the case reached the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the presiding judge Judge Howitt was very quick in handing down the verdict. He actually used, if I'm allowed to paraphrase, he actually used only 2 sentences. And the first one was that this case is dismissed on grounds that it is not the responsibility of the court to determine whether coal should be used in production of energy or not. That is a case that you should refer to the Senate or to the White House. Simple. In fact, if you look at how he handed down the case, I was a bit concerned whether the man was late for a dinner date. He was very brisk. And that actually leads to, for one to interrogate, to what extent can one use climate litigation to actually compel or nudge the government to shift from coal? So in looking at Juliana actually provided some key lessons to young people who might consider using climate litigation to actually force the government to move from coal. And this is very much so because of the number of countries which are still dependent on coal. The Juliana case actually provided 5 key lessons, and I believe those lessons will be useful not only for young South Africans who actually seek to actually halt the expansion on the coal plant, but for young people both in the global north and in the global south. And what are these 5 key lessons? I actually proposed the 5A. The first one is the art of litigation. Ordinarily, you cannot just walk up to a judge as a young person and say, "Oh, judge, yes," you submit a case and say, yes, judge, climate change is bad, bad. Then the judge will say, "Oh, yes, my son, it's fine, go home. The case is concluded. Take this one for transport. I'll finish the case." No. You need to be able to articulate your concern as to what exactly you want the court to do for you. So first of all, before you're actually considering you actually filing a case, you ought to consider whether the case you want to submit has any substance or will hold grounds when it's actually being deliberated. So first of all, the Juliana case has actually provided evidence that it is not just enough for you to approach a court on grounds of climate change. And why is it so? Simply because arguably, issues relating to environmentalism or climate change is one, perhaps from where I stand, or in my view, is one of the boring cases ever. And most judges are not actually keen on hearing such cases. Therefore, most cases often get tossed out at the first instance. So one ought to be very strategic. One ought to spice up one's case. And it is obvious that there is an untapped potential. There is a virgin forest which has actually not been explored. And that is very simple. That is that it's for one to actually invoke the principle of consumer protection. In the context of South Africa, there is a legislation which is the Consumer Protection Act. And in Section 34 of that Act, it actually places obligation on producers and distributors of goods and services to constantly inform their consumers of the negative effect of the product. I believe the same might apply in Germany and elsewhere. And I believe also that is why normally when you buy a cigarette, there is a note that cigarette has this cancer, it can cause X, Y, Z. When alcohol, they can tell you it has this alcoholic potential. But the question we ought to ask ourselves is, how often does the energy sector inform us or warn us that this computer we are using, it is generating so much gases from coal? How often are we told that when you charge your phone, because of your phone, you are actually emitting so much gas? These are very crucial information which ought to be known to consumers. And I believe that is one important ground that potential or prospective climate litigants ought to explore. And if by chance the energy sector happens to be able to listen to this recording, they will be able to take the initiative and constantly use SMS, emails to actually remind consumers of what we ought to do. Because I believe once we are privy to this information, we will be able to use electricity wisely, or perhaps shift to solar energy as a means of cutting back on emissions. The second is the question of asset. And when you speak of asset, it begs the question as to how much of this do you have? How much money, how much do you have to be able to support your case? Because it's not just simple for you to have a very good case. Because normally a good case can still be tossed out if you don't get the right person to actually articulate your point. And normally when you have insufficient capital to support your case, one of two things can happen. Because remember, you're going up against a big energy conglomerate. So one of two things can happen. Either the energy department or the energy agency can adopt the strategy of divide and rule, or they can strike the shepherd. How does it mean? How does it work? In every campaign, normally when you see there is youth movement, there are about 10, 15 young people who mobilize. There is always a weak link among the group. You are always bound to find your Judas within each group. And it's simple to notify that person and then buy the person out. With a truckload of money, with a truckload of employment promises, the person is about to switch camp. So you might submit your case. The next day, when the judge comes to the room, he will see the leading proponent of that litigation has now shifted camp, is now joining the defense. So you walk in and then you see John is sitting here today. The next thing John is sitting there, you'll be wondering, but gentlemen, you are supposed to be here. Then he will just tell you, oh, Your Honor, sorry, I've now been enlightened. I was blind, but now I can see. I'm now with the defense here. We are now going for clean coal. At that moment, your case, you must understand that your case is actually going down. The second option is that the energy agency can choose to buy out your lead lawyers. They can also buy your expert witnesses, which can collapse your case. So what do you have to do in terms of asset? The golden principle here is to build alliances. Build strong alliances, build strong networks with organizations or agencies which are pro-environmentalists. So here, you submit your case, you find people or actors like the RCC, you approach Christoph, you approach known, and perhaps he might also know other contacts whom he can pass on the information to. And before you know it, you'll be able to rally around sufficient network or alliances to support you throughout your case. The third one is the question of arena. Where do you submit your case? First of all, you must be able to know or shop for a pro-environmental judge or a court which will be able to accept your case. In the case of Juliana versus US, there were 3 judges who sat on the case. 2 were against the case because they couldn't bear the thought of actually granting such an order. The third, which was Judge Staton, was a pro-environmentalist and actually condemned his fellow judges that the refusal to entertain the case is actually going to jeopardize the future of the children. So it means that if you carefully choose your arena where you submit your case, you are bound to have a fair hearing. And speaking of arena also, the year October 2021, Greta Thunberg mobilized 15 young youth and submitted a case at the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The case was filed against 5 G20 countries: Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. And in this case, Greta Thunberg and then her young friends intimated or made one simple request, that the coal which is being used by these 5 countries is actually going to jeopardize their future. Of course, the case actually enjoyed considerable fanfare globally. And I was actually one of those who often cited that case in my presentations. However, in the same October of 2021, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child just actually kicked the case out. And why did they dismiss the case? They did not even open the floor for hearing. The simple fact is that the case cannot be brought straight up to the UN level without being tested on a domestic ground. So before you approach the UN, if you have a case against Germany, go to German court. If you have a case against Argentina, go to the local court and test the case there first before you come to us. So you can imagine how these young teenagers or young people go through all the 5 countries and test the case. So first of all, understand the local remedies before you actually submit such cases. The fourth one is assemble the masses. Once you have been able to identify a potential court to submit your case, mobilize the people who they ought to follow you, or they ought to also sign on to the case. In most cases, you find out that, for instance, in the Juliana versus US, there are only 21 youth on the case. And America has more than 20 million youth. Germany has about 8.5 million youth. South Africa has about 10 million youth. How can you submit a case when you have 21 in a country with about 20 million youth? You actually appear disingenuous. You appear dubious. So for you to have fair hearing, for you to be able to enjoy the hearing that you want, before submitting such a case, consider the demography in your area, in your country, and mobilize at least half of that population to follow you in submitting such a case and in subsequent hearings. With that, it gives legitimacy to what you are actually claiming to be representing, or the people you are actually claiming to be representing. The final one is that appeal for modest remedies. In simple terms, it means that don't become Oliver Twist, always asking for more. What does this imply? In most cases, you find young people who are actually demanding for an end to coal now, that countries ought to phase coal, phase out coal plants now. But the question we ought to ask ourselves is that, is this request possible? Is it feasible? Because simply, should you submit such a case to a judge and he grants that order that the energy sector ought to terminate coal plant now, it means that immediately this mic will be off. This computer will switch off. That is at the institutional level. Back home, he will just receive, or maybe whilst he's still in the office, he will receive a phone call from his daughter, normally his favorite daughter. Daddy, did you just say they should terminate our power? Then maybe you will say, oh, sweetheart, no. He will say, okay. No. Then the daughter will say, well, mommy is waiting for you in the living room. Immediately you will know that you don't even have to go home. So normally when you submit a request to a judge, or when you're looking for a remedy, submit reasonable remedies or make reasonable requests. In other words, you ought to simply ask, and then that is a possible remedy to ask, that about phasing out coal within a 20-year period. With this request, it will grant even the energy sector the leverage for it to gradually adopt renewables over that threshold. And this is a possible remedy which I believe will be able to sort of revolutionize the energy sector. Permit me to stop here. I thank you.